Cotton, good news! Oh, what is it? You don't have to use a hunk of green metal as your weapon anymore! Oh, really? That's fantastic! Yeah, now you can strap some fur on top of it! Wait, it's still in there?
Help me!
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, with the recent release of Title Update 2 for Monster Hunter Wilds, we had quite a bit of goodness added into the game, with 2 brand new monsters and the weapons to go along with them for each different weapon type. In this title update, we also had the addition of layered weapons as an option, which is lovely, and it means that there is now a lot less importance placed on what the best weapons are, at least in my opinion, because now I am not thinking as much about how much damage I would be losing to use something that isn't just a big chunk of green. Now I can have as much damage as possible while wielding heads on a stick, just as Ryozo intended. With that said, while it is less irritating for Artian weapons to be the best option now, that still leaves the big question that we'll be tackling today for each of the different weapon types, which is, are Artian still the best weapons? And of course, for any weapons where the best one wasn't an Artian before already, we will compare to their otherwise best weapons as well. This may not be 100% perfect, as while I do play every weapon in the game, I don't main every single one, but I did want to use some math and logic to help break it down in a way that at least gives you a basic idea of whether the new Lagiacrus or Seregios weapons are worth using in an optimized setup. In the previous title update, we did a video like this, and the main idea was, in a world without layered weapons, how much damage would you be losing to use the Shia or Mizutsune weapons over a perfect Artian weapon for the visual difference. Now that visuals aren't a factor anymore, we are going to simply be talking about which weapons are the best, and if it is still Artian, I will also mention how close the runner-up is, in case you don't want to deal with the RNG of the Artian system and don't yet have a perfectly rolled weapon. Starting off then with the Greatsword. Before Title Update 2, the best Greatsword was an Artian weapon. Generally speaking, it was either a 5 out of 5 attack reinforcement roll or a 4 out of 5 attack reinforcement with 1 sharpness boost, which was much more commonly used, so that's our main comparison for the weapon, which would be 225 attack, 5% affinity, 3 slots, and no inherent skills. The Lagiacrus Greatsword is 220 attack, 0% affinity, 550 thunder element, a big chunk of white sharpness, a 3 slot, 2 slot, and 1 slot, and then 2 ranks of focus and the new convert thunder resistance skill. The closest comparison for this weapon is actually the Shia Greatsword, which maths out to be pretty similar to a 220 attack Artian weapon, but it's slightly better than that for Greatsword, because while it has 5% less affinity than the Shia weapons, it also has 2 ranks of inherent focus, which is a skill that you would want to have regardless, and that makes up for the loss of 2 decoration slots compared to Artian. As a result, this weapon is slightly below a perfectly rolled Artian Greatsword, but except for Artian, this is likely the new best Greatsword option, beating out Shia by a small amount. As well, it of course has a big chunk of Thunder element and the Convert Thunder Resistance skill, which makes it even better against anything Thunder weak, and arguably the best Greatsword against Thunder weak enemies, though it's still the second best against anything else, given that Greatsword mostly just cares about raw attack. For the Seregios weapon, it's just super not worth it for Greatsword, sadly. 210 attack and 25% affinity, a super tiny slice of white sharpness, 3 slot, 2 slot, 1 slot, and bladescale honing as a skill. This skill makes it so when you roll through an attack from an enemy, you get a special sharpness bar for a few hits, and that special sharpness bar makes your damage modifier 1.4 times instead of whatever your sharpness modifier otherwise would have been. This is around a 6% damage increase in general over white sharpness for the same hits, so it is quite good while active, and so it has the potential to be strong, but the skill is based around using iframes to evade through attacks, and Greatsword is one of the least evadey weapons in the game, between the offset, the shoulder tackle, the generic guard that you can do, and especially the fact that you often want to sheathe your Greatsword between attacks, and the skill only activates when you iframe dodge with your weapon drawn. So if you care about being effective, I really don't think this is a great match for this weapon type at all. Moving on to the longsword then, for the Lagiacrus weapon, it is now the best Thunder element option. Generally speaking, before Title Update 2, longsword players would simply run an Artian weapon with 4 attack reinforcements, 1 sharpness reinforcement, so 225 attack, and then swap which element of Artian to match the weakness of the monster you are going to fight. The Lagiacrus longsword is just straight up better than a Thunder longsword statistically. It has power prolonger, which you probably wouldn't use, but it has 100 extra base Thunder on it. It has way more sharpness, which saves you from doing sharpness management skills, and it has Convert Thunder Resistance as a skill on it, which combines to be worth more than 5 raw attack and 5% affinity from the Artian, just barely. For anything that isn't thunder weak, however, you still want to do exactly what you were doing before, Artian weapon that matches the elemental weakness of the monster. And even if you don't have perfect rolls, element matching will still be better for longsword than trying to use Lagiacrus longsword as a one-size-fits-all solution. So it's the new best for thunder, otherwise same as before. For the Seregios longsword, this one is a bit funkier because unlike greatsword, longsword does have attacks that have evasion built into them, and especially because foresight slash counts as triggering bladescale honing. That said, with element being as useful as it currently is for the weapon, going pure raw on longsword is a fair bit of loss to begin with. The affinity and attack stats even out to not be that much worse than an Artian weapon, but the amount of white sharpness is just not a manageable amount for this weapon unless you are constantly proccing bladescale honing, which just isn't realistic in most fights for most players with this weapon, especially as the majority of your damage always happens during monster downtime, like stuns, knockdowns, paralysis, stuff like that, and during those periods of damage, you do not have any attacks you can dodge through to trigger bladescale honing and get the special sharpness. So the Seregios longsword is a super cool concept, and you can use it if you like its playstyle, but it is a firm step below using an element Artian longsword or the Lagiacrus longsword even as well. Next up, sword and shield. Before title update 2, the general optimized choice was the same as longsword, an Artian weapon of whatever element matches the weakness of the monster you're going to fight, and with either 4 attack reinforcements and 1 sharpness boost, or 3 attack and 2 sharpness for a bit more comfort. In that comparison though, Lagiacrus sword and shield is by far the best option against thunder weak monsters, especially as it gets 2 offensive guard on it naturally, which is a skill that is incredible for the weapon anyways and you'd probably want to use regardless. At 220 attack, it is slightly lower than a 4 attack roll Artian, but identical to a 3 attack roll, which is what I recommend more for the average player anyways, as 5 attack isn't worth losing sharpness comfort unless you are literally trying to speedrun. So if we are comparing this to a 3 attack reinforcement Artian, it has even better sharpness, like you should never have to sharpen in the middle of a zone. It has 20 more element than a thunder Artian SNS with those rolls as well, but you lose 5% affinity. You lose 1 slot decoration slot level, but you gain convert thunder resistance for even more thunder power. The overall result though is that this is better than a perfectly rolled thunder element Artian by a fair margin, and only very slightly behind a raw focused Artian sword and shield as well, but I'd recommend either using a status or using the other element Artians for a monster that has different weaknesses than thunder, similar to what we said for longsword. As for the Seregios sword and shield, it's a fun gimmick, but for similar reasons as the longsword, it isn't going to be meta in optimized setups. The bladescale honing effect does activate on your back hop, which is a nice bonus way to use it, but without element or status, you lose a ton of the actual damage potential. And again, with bladescale honing, it can be a very strong effect when active. You simply have no way to activate it against a downed monster, a knocked out monster, a sleeping monster, so on and so forth. And that makes it just not quite as strong as a result. I'd say it's the equivalent of a raw Artian weapon with 215 attack, which is to say that it isn't like a bad weapon by any means, but it is a notable step down from either the Artian element or status options, or the Lagiacrus weapon for thunder as well now. Next up then we have dual blades, and you're going to notice a bit of a theme starting to pop up by this point, but dual blades are one of the weapons that leans even more towards element than raw compared to the other weapons we've talked about so far, even more so now in Title Update 2 with some of the changes we've had as well. Before this update, the generally best dual blades were Artian weapons with an element to match the weakness of the monster that you're fighting, with 4 attack reinforcement rolls and 1 sharpness boost. For the Lagiacrus dual blades then, this is where things get a little funky compared to the other weapon types, because the inherent skill is power prolonger, which isn't bad but also not great. It's generally not something that you would use in one of your slots on an Artian weapon. The sharpness is way better than Artian, to the point that you no longer even have to use razor sharp, however, which is a really big space saver. So it actually wins out on skill space and decoration space in comparison. However, this is one of the only examples where the Lagiacrus weapon has less thunder element as a base than a thunder Artian weapon does with no element reinforcements, as the Lagiacrus weapon is 250 compared to thunder Artian's 270. Dual blades is a heavily element leaning weapon, and so that is actually a pretty big deal to consider. That said, it also has convert thunder resistance as an inherent skill, which for dual blades will give you 4 extra thunder attack for every 1 thunder resistance that you have. Meaning if you have 5 thunder resistance, it now makes it even with the Artian's element amount, and any thunder resistance that you have above 5 makes it even better than the Artian weapon. So again, overall we have a pretty clear situation of the Lagiacrus weapon being better than the Thunder Element Artian option. But aside from that, for monsters that aren't weak to Thunder, for monsters that are weak to other things, your best choice is to just use an Artian that matches their weaknesses. For the Seregios dual blades, then, this had some potential given that dual blades are a super evasion heavy weapon type, but because the weapon is also skewed so heavily towards element damage, it's just not really worth using these in an optimized setup full stop. If you want to use raw attack dual blades for whatever reason, it's sadly still just better to use an Artian weapon with a status on top of it, or even the Shia weapon. This isn't to say that you can't use these weapons for some fun and enjoyment, but if we are talking about optimal setups, this just isn't that. After that, then we've got the hammer. Before Title Update 2, the optimal setup was to use an Artian weapon with whatever element the monster was weak to, ideally with 4 attack boost reinforcements and 1 sharpness. Maybe 2 sharpness for pure comfort, but not very necessary. The Lagiacrus hammer is again better than the Thunder Artian options, with 100 more Thunder element than base Artian Thunder hammer, and that's before counting Convert Thunder resistance as well. Again, 220 attack and a super comfortable amount of white sharpness as well. The only downside really is that your inherent skill on this one is 2 Slugger, which is not a bad skill in itself, but if you are trying to optimize your damage, there are far better options you could have had in those slots. That said, this still outpaces the Thunder Artian hammer by a fair bit, and even against things that aren't weak to Thunder, it's still equivalent to a 3 attack roll Artian weapon, but with some extra stun power too, so this is honestly really solid. For the Seregios hammer, this is a weapon that actually can make better use of the skill than most, as hammer leans less into elements than most of the weapons that have inbuilt dodge attacks. Charge Step can activate bladescale honing, which is relatively useful, and you attack slowly enough with hammer that the special sharpness actually does last for a few hits properly, and importantly, it is enough special sharpness to let you get off your mighty charge slam. That said, hammer, especially in Title Update 2, is an absolute offsetting machine, and so choosing to iframe dodge an attack instead of trying to offset it just feels like a misplay in my mind, just every time. So I'd say this is relatively equivalent to a 3 attack reinforcement raw Artian weapon, with the caveat that you'd have to adjust to a less effective playstyle to actually make it be that strong. After that, then we have the Hunting Horn, and this is where things get a little bit more interesting in my mind, as Hunting Horn does have a bit more to consider. Generally speaking, the best Hunting Horn is harder to quantify because of song lists and elemental power, but in Wilds, as of this moment, the weapon has generally leaned a bit more towards element than pure raw, and sometimes it's Artian, sometimes it's crafted. It mostly depends on the song set and if you're willing to swap back and forth between 2 horns. That said, even more so than the other weapons so far, Lagiacrus Hunting Horn is unbelievably good against Thunder weak monsters. It is the best option by far for those fights. 230 attack, which is higher than most Lagiacrus weapons are to begin with, and equivalent to a 5 attack reinforcement Artian weapon, which would have pitiful sharpness in comparison to this weapon. But even then, past that, it has 450 base Thunder, which is a massive amount, and then we have the songs, the melodies. The Echo Bubble itself is defense and elemental resistance up. The resistance increase there fuels Convert Thunder resistance to be even more Thunder attack for the weapon. On top of that, it also has Thunder resistance large as a melody, which will fuel it even further to give you even higher Thunder attack, and you've also got element attack boost melody, which raises elemental attack in general. So the Thunder element that this is capable of is absolutely sort of insane, not to mention the fact that those things also affect all of your allies if you're playing with other people using Lagiacrus weapons. But then on top of that, it also has Divine Protection melody, which is a top tier survival song. It also has Echo Wave Thunder to apply that really high Thunder element that you have, and it also has Offset melody to give you a bit more safety while playing as well. It is just an absolutely cracked new weapon. It's only really worth it on Thunder weak monsters as it leans so heavily into Thunder, but it is so good for those specific fights that it's hard not to say that you should make this right now. As for Seregios Hunting Horn, pure raw Hunting Horn isn't really a thing right now that is being done in optimal playstyles, so that is really already a hit for the weapon. The Echo Bubble is evasion and movement speed up, which isn't bad at all, and sort of fits the theme and makes it easier to use bladescale honing. And then for the melodies, there's honestly just nothing really offensive going on here. There's no attack up large or anything like that, so overall for Hunting Horn especially, this weapon is a bit of a dud in my opinion. Moving on to Lance then, big surprise, the best weapons before Title Update 2 were generally the Artian weapon, specifically matching element with whatever element the monster is weak to. And unlike most of the weapon types so far, the damage is so heavily skewed towards elements for Lance that meta builds were going 4 element reinforcements on the weapon and 1 sharpness boost. But 4 attack reinforcements isn't crazy far behind the element reinforcements, so that to say, Lagiacrus Lance has 100 more base thunder than an Artian Thunder Lance has without reinforcements, but if you do 4 reinforcements, then the Lagiacrus Lance either has 100 less thunder, but 15 more raw attack if your Artian is element focused, or it just has 5 less raw, but still 100 more element if your Artian is more raw focused. In either case, the Lagiacrus Lance ends up taking over in overall potency when you factor in convert thunder resistance as a skill and the value that that can have, especially with the much longer sharpness bar considered as well. You do lose some decoration space, which would normally be used for sharpness. The ideal Lance setup was an offensive guard jewel with a bonus rank of element attack, a critical element jewel with a bonus rank of element attack, and then a razor sharp jewel with a 3rd bonus rank of element attack. So this different configuration for the weapon means that you'll be also losing out on 2 element attack ranks as well. Overall, this means that because of the element skew for the weapon and the decoration space, and because the inherent skill is guard, which is a quality of life skill, but not one that you would want to go out of your way for in an optimized damage setup, the Thunder Artian Lance is actually a touch better than the Lagiacrus Lance. If your Thunder Artian Lance was one with attack reinforcements instead though, the Lagiacrus Lance is better in effectiveness overall. But if you have an element-based Artian, it is better than Lagiacrus. For Seregios Lance, however, well, Lance genuinely skews more towards element than any other weapon we've mentioned so far, so a purely raw weapon is not very good. Not to mention that you won't be dodging much with Lance because it is a guard-based weapon at its core. If you are dodging with Lance, it's probably sheathed anyways, so I just do not recommend the Seregios Lance at all. Next up, we've got Gunlance, and before Title Update 2, the best Gunlances were, thanks to changes in the previous patch, Artian weapons with a full 5 attack reinforcements, as it is the weapon that cares more about attack than anything else. It doesn't really care for element, it has minimal care for sharpness and such, and so essentially our comparison is to a 230 attack beast that has slightly strong shelling modifier, which is also a big deal. That said, Lagiacrus Gunlance is 220 attack, which is a noticeable drop from 230. The Thunder element is not overly relevant for this weapon's meta playstyle, and the sharpness also doesn't help much because sharpness does not affect shelling. That said, it does have slightly strong shelling power as a base, so it is definitely a usable Gunlance. It's just noticeably worse than a properly rolled Artian Gunlance. If you are going to avoid Artian Gunlances though, you may as well just use the Shia Gunlance, which is overall a little bit better than this one. All that said, you can play Elemental Gunlance, and if you do, this is going to be the king of Thunder Gunlances specifically. It's just not the optimal playstyle generally speaking. As far as the Seregios weapon, if you've heard the words that I've just been saying, you probably already know, but it's not at all worth using for the meta playstyle. The main benefit of Seregios weapons is the weapon skill and the special sharpness modifier, but sharpness does not affect shelling, which is the majority of Gunlance's damage, and that said, unlike most Seregios weapons, this one is 220 attack with 25% affinity, so it is a decent chunk of bonus attack to make up for this discrepancy, but affinity doesn't affect shelling either, so that's also a hit. If you then focus on the weapon hits themselves with this weapon though, you can do it, you can make this work, and especially given that in Title Update 2, Gunlance actually has a lot of synergy with the Seregios armor set in general. If you are trying to proc Adrenaline Rush anyways, it's not bad to have bladescale honing activate as a bonus, but that to say that in the standard optimal playstyle, nothing has changed for Gunlance. You're still using Artian weapons, but for specifically Thunder Element, or for specifically non-shelling focused raw melee gameplay, the new weapons are actually quite good. For Switch Axe then, the best options before the title update were specifically Artian weapons with 3 attack reinforcements and 2 sharpness, or the Shia weapon as a very close sort of alternative. Unlike most of the weapons on this list though, Switch Axe was technically best with paralysis instead of element matching, because the best playstyle is spamming full release slash, and paralysis gives you more windows to spam that attack within. So keep in mind that neither of these new weapons have paralysis, and so it is better to compare to the Shia weapon as a result. For Lagiacrus Switch Axe, this is a power file weapon, which means it's used towards raw damage. It is good for full release slash in general in the standard playstyle. It has power prolonger on it, which is something that you'd honestly want anyways for Switch Axe, so that is great. It has a ton of white sharpness, which is lovely. It has Thunder Element just as a bonus on the hits themselves, and then of course convert thunder resistance as a skill. This is without question better than Shia switch axe against anything that is even remotely weak to thunder, and against anything that is immune to dragon as well, of course, which there are a couple of monsters. For less specific matchups, the weapons are actually very comparable to each other. They're very close, but Shia probably still pulls out a little bit ahead due to the White Flame Torrent skill and its random damage procs. For the Seregios switch axe, this one is funky because it's actually a dragon file switch axe, which aren't particularly common, with the only other real option for that being Guardian de Shagama switch axe. Seregios is better than that overall though, I would say, particularly because bladescale honing is something that you can use quite reasonably with switch axe as a weapon, especially if you're going with a full release / spam style playstyle, as that uses a relatively small amount of sharpness to use on repeat, meaning you can get more out of the special sharpness meter when you proc it. So in general, I would say that this is the best dragon file switch axe option now, but that is definitely quite a niche victory to have. Moving on from that then, we've got the Charge Blade, and this weapon has gone through some pretty major shakeups in Title Update 2 that make it a little bit harder to quantify, as more testing does need to be done to work out what the ideal playstyle now looks like. That said, we can still answer the question of weapon value relatively simply. Before the update, the best Charge Blades were Artian Charge Blades, often with statuses on them that had either 3 or 4 attack reinforcements, and the other slots being sharpness. So for comfort, a 220 attack weapon with 5% affinity; for pure offense, a 225 attack weapon with 5% affinity. Lagiacrus Charge Blade lets you have a big pile of thunder element, but still have an impact file underneath it. This makes it a uniquely good choice for a raw focused playstyle if the monster that you're going against is also weak to thunder. It also has 2 ranks of artillery as the inherent skills, which are quite solid, if not quite the perfect choice. So generally I would say this is the best impact Charge Blade against a thunder weak monster. But that's about the limit of it, as otherwise you'd probably rather have something like a status from the Artian Charge Blade, or even the Shia Charge Blade for the bonus pops of damage as well. As for the Seregios switch axe, this loses out against the ones that we just talked about, of course, especially as Charge Blade is a more perfect guard, and guard point focused weapon, so you won't be going out of your way to dodge through attacks with iframes that often. And even if you do, files, the actual file explosions, do not scale with sharpness, and with Power Axe mode itself being nerfed in this update, the fact that the mode chews through sharpness anyways, honestly, I would say this is just not really worth using in an optimized setup for Charge Blade. And then after that, we have our final melee weapon, the Insect Glaive. Before the title update, the best Insect Glaives were undeniably Artian Insect Glaives that match the monster's element weakness, and that have 2 sharpness and 3 attack boost reinforcements. So it would be a 220 attack weapon with 5% affinity, a decent chunk of sharpness, and then 280 element of your choice. The Lagiacrus Insect Glaive is 220 attack, 0% affinity, 300 thunder as a base, so a higher amount, an obscene amount of white sharpness, which is absolutely lovely, and then it has 2 focus as the bonus inherent skill. Focus isn't one of the skills that I would personally put on an Artian weapon in the meta set, so this is a straight up loss, and what you're going without is likely to be 2 levels of critical boost, which is nothing to scoff at. That's up to 6% damage lost on your raw attacks. However, you also have Convert Thunder Resistance to consider too, which means the element amount is notably higher. Overall, this should be pretty much equivalent to the Thunder Artian weapon against thunder weak monsters. And when you hit the body parts that are more weak to thunder, the Lagiacrus Insect Glaive will do more damage, and against body parts that are less weak to thunder, the Artian Glaive will do more damage. So they are actually extremely comparable to each other and very close overall. That said, you also get focus as a bonus on top of that, which does make it faster to charge your offset attack, so pretty much even in offensive potential, but a bit more quality of life and comfort on the Lagiacrus option specifically. For Seregios Insect Glaive, you lose a lot from the weapon not having any element on it because Insect Glaive loves element, and while Insect Glaive can be a pretty evade heavy weapon, you also do have an offset that you want to use, and unlike most weapons, the special sharpness bar is just too short for Insect Glaive to last the whole way through your strongest combo, being Descending Slash into the Big Dragon Burst, so the Steve Glaive is not very competitive in a meta build for the weapon. However, there's also a third weapon to talk about for the Glaive, which is the Kanafa Glaive. Just to mention it, it is pure raw, it has Airborne as an inherent skill, which is actually quite good. That's a skill you would want to use anyways, and that takes up a very large slot. It has 230 attack, which is great, but it needs Handicraft to breach white sharpness, and so when you factor in the skill cost of that and the lack of element on the weapon, it just does not quite compare to the strongest Insect Glaives that we have. But it is genuinely not a bad weapon at the very least, and it also has level 10 Kinsect power for an extra bonus to your Kinsect specifically. Then finally we have the ranged weapons. For this is actually pretty simple in the best of ways. For light and heavy bowgun, let's talk about Seregios weapons first, as these are just absolutely incredibly good. Bladescale loading, which is the ranged weapon version of bladescale honing, is a 40% damage boost on 3 special shots that load after an iframe dodge. So mechanically, this is way better than the melee version of the skill. The actual offensive gain is significantly more than the melee version of the skill as well. On top of that, both of the bowguns have evading reload as an extra bonus skill, which just straight up reloads 1 shot of ammo whenever you evade, even further bonus for the weapon. They also both have the ability to do normal and spread 3 ammo, but the heavy bowgun also has slicing ammo, which is fun to play around too. Generally speaking, these are now the best choice possible if you actually want to play normal, light or heavy bowgun, or spread light or heavy bowgun, and of course slicing heavy bowgun. They don't work like anything else, they are totally unique honestly, and they are far superior to the other options for these purposes. I highly recommend these weapons, and even if you are someone who doesn't normally play bowguns, maybe make a Steve bowgun and give it a try, because it does feel totally different. As for Lagiacrus bowguns then, these are very clearly focused around thunder ammo, and they are actually better than a perfectly rolled thunder Artian weapon. There's not a whole lot of nuance to that, they're simply capable of higher output with a higher magazine. It's not better by an insane amount, but it is better than the thunder Artian options full stop. Then finally we have the bow, and this is where things get a little bit more complex. Before Title Update 2, you would basically just want to use either a fire or water Artian bow with 5 attack reinforcement rolls due to the fact that those weapons had close range coating, which is the strongest coating option. Another option was arkveld bow, which also had some uses for very highly dragon weak enemies like Shia. But Artian weapon with 230 attack is going to be our best source of comparison. That said, the Lagiacrus bow is a high damage thunder bow with close range coating, so while it isn't quite as strong for a pure raw damage matchup as the Artian bows, it is specifically better than any other thunder bow that we have, so it does at least fill that niche. But you also lose some crit boost to make this happen, so it really is only worth it against properly thunder weak monsters. For the Seregios bow, it is a lot more interesting. Bladescale loading gives you 3 shots of special coating, which increase the damage by 25% more than whatever your coating normally would be. So this does stack with close range coating, and it is quite potent as a result. However, bow also has Guardian Deshagama bow as an option for pure raw, which does hit for larger numbers than the Seregios bow when you don't have special coatings, but it hits for lower numbers than Seregios with these special coatings active. Bow is a weapon that can have particularly high uptime on the bladescale loading skill due to the inbuilt perfect dodge mechanics of the weapon, and so this is definitely a better Steve weapon to use, and honestly this is probably the most complex one to tell you how it compares to the other options, but the long and short of it is, if you have around 40% uptime on these special coatings, even especially with your higher damage attacks, then the Steve bow will overtake all of the other ones in value. In solo hunts, this is actually quite achievable, but in multiplayer, the monster likely won't be focusing you enough to let this actually happen. So this can be the best bow, but it is dependent on how the hunt actually goes in practice. That just about does it for today then everyone, a full breakdown of how the new weapons compare to the old best weapons for each weapon type in the game. Again, I don't main these weapons, so if I missed some sort of context, please leave it in the comments down below to help your fellow hunters out. But I wanted to make sure to make this and give you all sort of an update on how things are looking in the immediate aftermath of Title Update 2. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.